Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and today is the 4th of May.
5th of May.
What?
It's the 5th.
Oh. And today is the 5th of May, so I guess that means I need to make something for the bad guys. Also, I like robots, and one of my all-time favorite builds that I ever builded was the TIE fighter that I made way back when. Unfortunately, I made that earlier on in this channel's lifetime when clay was at a premium, so I had to trade it for a block of unbaked clay in order to make something new. Which means I don't have any big stompy Star Wars Gundam robots in my house, and I think that needs to change. I could, of course, have just remade that robot, but I'm not really keen on revisiting past projects, so instead I opted for something a little different this time, which is why I've made a low-poly AT ST head out of clay, cardboard, and aluminium tape. Once I've got my head shape shaped out, I'll wrap it in another layer of Super Sculpey, since Super Sculpey's a lot firmer than Cosclay, and it's a lot easier to sand. Before I do any sanding though, I'll cut the sides flat with a knife, gouge out the rough location of its eyeball windows, then lay out some clay to make the side panels. I'll then unpeel this overly thick panel and transfer that to a thinner sheet so I can make two equally sized mirrored panels. Then it's into the oven to bake all my pieces before giving the whole thing a great big sanding. The head's also a bit too tall, so I'll saw a section off the bottom before attaching my side panels with a shocking amount of bacon bond. With the panels attached, there's still a few gaps around the edges, so I'll fill them in with lots of little wormy dealies before sanding everything flat again. Now before I add all the detail though, I want to at least build out the bones of the body using this extra heavy gauge armature wire. I'll drill a big hole in the bottom of the head and stick my halved wire in before bending and twisting the wires into the shape I want. Now I've done a bit of mathing to make sure that the wire is the correct length for the legs, but while I was doing all that mathing, I completely forgot to account for the extra length on the bottom of the legs, which would allow me to mount my legs in the mounting block. So as is par for the course, I had to remove these legs and replace them with another pair that I made off camera. Fortunately, these have feet that fit nicely into my sculpting block. Otherwise, with my legs in place, I can pop the head off again and get on to adding all that detail. I'll start by adding pew-pew mounting points, then work my way around the head, adding the various panels and larger surface sections. The head's the most recognizable part of the sculpture, so I want it to be relatively accurate to the original design, so I'll take a bit of time to make sure the majority of the pieces are where they're supposed to be. Honestly, I think the reason this video is 2 days late is because in my little pea brain I was convinced I could make this head in a couple hours. It's a slightly wonky square with a bunch of panels attached. How long can it really take? A long time. It took a long time. This took a long time. Mostly because I was handling it so much and I was constantly moving it around, so each time I added a panel I had to bake the head to make sure those panels stayed flat and clean. That means roughly 30 minutes to bake and 15 minutes or so to cool down enough to attach more pieces. For every single panel. Now for visual continuity, I've cut and edited this video so it looks like I made each section one at a time, but I was of course working on the other parts while the head was baking. Regardless, it took a long time. It took a long time. Eventually my panels are in place so I can add the big mouth lasers, which are made out of drilled out dowel, as well as some cables underneath that I made by sticking some twine into pre-drilled holes and hardening it with some super thin CA glue. Otherwise, that's the head mostly finished, but before I set it aside, I'll use a Forstner bit to drill some big holes into the cheek balls, since that's where I intend to add the arms later. Then I'll drill a couple arm holes within the bigger shoulder holes, and that's the head completely completed, so it's finally time to fancy up those legs. Much like the head, I'm going to be keeping the legs at least somewhat accurate to the original Chicken Walker design. Really, that just means that I want the legs to be skinny and awkwardly posed, with knees that bend backwards rather than anthropomorphized legs like I had with the TIE fighter. After all, the AT ST already has legs, so why change them? The really tricky part though is covering the wire with just enough clay to square the shape off while making sure that the legs aren't too thick. Once the initial clay layer's been baked, I can lift the legs up and slip some flat eggs onto the tips to make my clompy robo feet. Then with the flat eggs slightly rounded into a slightly rounded but still flat egg shape, I can start to add the little leg details. It's at about this point that I start to deviate from the original design in favor of just sticking random greeblies in place to make it look busy and mechanical. Nobody's actually going to be paying much attention to the legs anyway, so I think I'm probably safe being a little less specific here. Also, this is going to be a repurposed mech, so it makes sense that some bits and pieces have been replaced along the way. I don't do any kit bashing, and I've never built an actual Gundam or any sort of robot, so I imagine this is as close as I'll ever get. Eventually though, the body is covered in copious bits and bobs and squares and tubes and toothpicks and wires, and it's safe to say it's finished, so I'll attach the head and figure out how I want to make the arms. I've made the arm bones by winding some wire on itself to create a rust-proof DNA strand that I can stick into my shoulder sockets, then cut to size. Then I'll spend a distressing amount of time bending and repositioning the arms until I've got a pose that I like, at which point I'll pull the arms out and lay some cling film over the socket so I can fill it with clay and reattach the arms to get a perfect fit that can be easily removed. This will give me a perfectly fitting socket that I can detach and reattach at my pleasure. All that's left to do then is spend another hour or so reposing the arms before covering them in a thin layer of clay and building up the various bits and bobs in the same way that I did with the legs. The big difference here is that I don't have any original design to base these arms on, so I have to use my imagination, which, if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, I'm sure you're well aware is kind of a terrifying thing. Fortunately, it's hard to get too weird with robot arms, so once I've added lots of little ball and socket joints and random panels and cables and just general robot looking things, I've got a pair of beautiful robot arms ready to be dry fit onto my otherwise relatively standard Scout Walker. Now, the astute among you may have noticed he's a little hands-free at the moment, but that's because before I make him any hands, I want to make him something to hold. When I made the TIE Fighter, a lot of comments said I should have made him a shield, and while I try not to pander to your idea since I don't want to encourage you, I do have to admit that it's kind of a fun idea. Of course, if I'm making a shield, it needs to be thematic, so I decided that instead of a proper shield, what if he was holding a repurposed TIE Fighter wing? Now, I could have made the standard wonky hexagonal wing that's flat and easy to make, or, and hear me out, I can make the advanced TIE Fighter wing that's slightly curved and probably a hell of a lot harder to make, but it'll look slightly curved. Oh, and I made a little handle out of more of the twine-turned cabling. Now, for the other hand, I seriously considered giving him a huge Gundam-sized gun, but eventually settled on a sword because swords are always the right decision. The other option, of course, would have been a lightsaber, but that would have involved running the wiring and somehow hiding that in his body, which, now that I think about it, would have been really easy since he's a robot and I could have just had the wires exposed. Whatever, swords are cool. Otherwise, with my sword and board built, I can attach them to the model, except of course I now need to make some hands, which I planned for by making his arms end in little balls. And rather than sculpting his hands out of soft, malleable, fingerprint-absorbing clay, I've pre-baked a little block that I can cut into a set of equally sized fingers, and 2 thumbs, of course. I'll then cut these down into the individual finger segments, drill a couple holes into the sides of each, then stick them together with some teeny tiny armature wire and glue. I'll then give them a quick sanding so they're all roughly the same size before attaching them to a pre-baked palm that I'll build up with a layer of clay before sticking it onto a ball stylus at the final detailing. These can then be popped off that ball stylus and stuck onto the arm balls. Because they're segmented and built with bendy wire, I can get the pose I want by wrapping the fingers around the hilt of the sword and the handle of the shield. Also, it gives me ample opportunity to change my mind another dozen times or so with the posing before I'm finished. All that's left to do then is add some extra little greeblies around the body by way of antennae and lots of little bolts and rivets everywhere that feels a little bit too bland. Last but not least, this Robo-Boy is a bit too pristine given his penchant for getting up close and personal, so I'll take some time to really mess his shit up. With that though, the sculpting is all but finished, so I can do one final assembly before moving on to the painting. And to save myself some serious heartbreak, I'm going to do the base coat with my airbrush. Now, in staying true to form, I'm going to paint the clay the same color it already is and give the gray body a nice gray base coat. Mostly this is so it has a unifying gray coat, but also so that any washes and stains I add later might have something to hold on to. The shield though, I'll give a bluish gray base coat since the TIE fighters tend to be a bit darker, and this will help it stand out a tiny bit against the gray body. For the next step, I'll reassemble my walker and start stippling some charcoal black all over the place. I love a good bruised, beaten, and battered robot, and this will help it to look like it's taken a hell of a lot of battle damage. The sponge makes for some excellent random looking marks, while the brush will help me reach spots the sponge is otherwise too unwieldy to touch. I also decided that while it's thematically accurate, the gray was maybe a bit too gray, and I wanted to add a splash of color here and there, so I'll paint some strategically placed orange lines on the left arm and the body, and some darker blue spots on the right arm. And then once those colors have dried, I can come back with my sponge and re-chip the parts that I painted over. For the shield, I'll paint the panels with a proper black, then dry brush a series of light and dark grays over the top to make the panels look a little bit more weathered before adding some steel metallics along the edge of the panels and inside all the chips and bullet holes. Then I'll take that same steel paint and paint the blade of the sword, since I'm a fan of the idea of a robot just swinging a massive medieval-styled sword. Finally, everything's a bit too bright for my liking, so I'm going to take the opportunity to try something new. One thing I like to do when I am painting in my spare time is use oil washes, since they wipe away nicely and add lovely recessed shading that you just can't get with an acrylic wash. However, it takes a long time for oil to dry, and again, this video has taken me significantly longer than I'd like, so I need to figure something else out. Enter Noosh, which is a new product that claims to be the acrylic answer to oil washes. Basically, you can theoretically brush it on a model, then wipe the excess off, leaving you with some really interesting streaks and recessed shading. In sticking with the north of the border approach to a project, this is my first time using it, so I'm kinda learning as I go, and while I think it's pretty heckin' neat, there's a few kinks I need to iron out. One, I need to get my ratios correct, since the first few panels had too much black paint and the last few panels had too little, giving me some obvious variation in the color. And two, I really should have clear coated this before applying the Noosh. With oil washes, you can apply them directly over unprotected acrylic, then wipe it off with mineral spirits, since the spirits don't affect the acrylic. However, with Noosh, it's an acrylic compound, and acrylic stains acrylic, so I ended up tinting the gray several shades darker. In the grand scheme of things, I think it turned out pretty good, but if I had, I don't know, another week to work on this, I bet I could have made this look a hell of a lot better. Finally, since I refuse to make anything metal without copious layers of rust, I'll add the final copious layers of rust around the edges of the panels and in all the recesses. All in all though, I think this well-worn robot swordsman is looking pretty dope. All he needs now then is a comparatively bright base to stand on. For the base, I figured I could just do a cheap and cheerful sandy base, since in a galaxy far, far away, there seems to be an inordinate amount of dusty planets, where they just keep visiting Tatooine because it's cheap to film there. Also, he's gonna need a rock to stand on. I make this block into a rock by hacking away until the blockiness becomes rockiness, at which point it's time to add the rocky texture, which means rocks. Once I've rocked my rock, I can cut some cuts into the side so it's a slightly more striated rock, and then I took some offcuts to make some smaller rocks, which I can then turn into proper rocks by adding more rocky texture. Except even I can acknowledge that this seems like a bad idea, so to save my hands, enter the tin can. I'll put my foam rocks in, then add my rocky rocks and give it a good shake. And with that, my foam rocks look like rocky rocks, and I didn't break my fingers. Also, somewhere in all of this, I turned the blocky base into a rocky base in much the same manner and test fit my Robo Boy in place to figure out where the rocks would go. Next, I'll trace out my rocky outline so I can texture the top of the phone using fire. This melts the foam ever so slightly, creating a nice bumpy ridge, and coats my lungs in a protective film of airborne plastic particles. I'll then use a drill bit to line up the rock with my pre-poked hole, and hot glue will hold everything else in place. With the rocks in place, we're looking good, but it's more the surface of an asteroid than a dusty desert, so we need to prime it white. Now with the white primer in place, we are well primed to start adding some color. And by color, I mean varying shades of sand. I'll start by slapping some yellowy and orangey watery washes haphazardly around the base, letting it flow and mix as it wants. And once that's had a chance to dry, I'll give the whole thing a heavy sepia wash to darken the recesses and tie the varying shades together before dusting the tips with some dusty bone white and white highlights. I'll lay down some nasty, well-loved cardboard, then to make my sand, I'm going to use some sand-colored grout. Grout is extra fine and works really well at this scale. A healthy top coat of white sriracha hot sauce will create a nice sticky base for the grout to adhere to, while a sieve and a spoon will keep my sand looking sandy. I can then use the old toothbrush and vacuum combo to knock the excess loose, then I can lock the rest of the sand in place with a heavy spritzing of alcohol. Before the sand sets, I'll press the swordsman's feet in place and press him into the sand, then dust his feet and lower legs with some more grout to show he's been stomping through this sandy wasteland for some time. A quick spritz to lock the leg sand in place, and I can do my final assembly. Otherwise, with my sandy swordsman in place, I'd say we're all done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, a massive thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a big old hey how are you to my newest patrons: Bradley Newell, Simon O'Brien, Anna, Said the Magpie, Emeralds, Beastie2K, Meg G, Acalia, Richard Black, Caesar, Ainsley Loves North of the Border, Adrian Moore, Floanne Art, Big Boy Barnold, Artem Chubarian, Shark Dad, Houston Leah, Morwen Pendle, Jackalope Finley and Oliver, Charles, Nick White, and Dr. Rye is awesome. You are the not quite right arms that hold up this broken windshield of a channel. Happy belated Star Wars Day. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.